Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know more folks are going to be joining us, but I really want to maximize our time together today for this really important conversation on kids as kids, challenging the prosecution of youth as adults. I am Rachel Marshall. I'm the executive director of the IIP, and we host monthly webinars to provide education, strategies, and insight for prosecutors and stakeholders in improving their approaches to public safety. The IIP provides a national platform to bring together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to promote data-driven strategies, cutting-edge scholarship, and innovative thinking. The IIP champions criminal justice reform policies that advance community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. As I mentioned, I'm really excited for today's discussion because it feels incredibly timely as we are continuing to hear more and more about juvenile justice issues in the news, and specifically a lot of conversation around the practice of prosecuting youth as adults. A lot of the rhetoric that we've seen recently is in many ways very tired and familiar, as there are new fears around crimes committed by young people, which echo some of the, for those who are old enough to remember, the super predator language of the past. And we are seeing increased calls for prosecuting young people as adults, even young people as young as 14 years old. And this rhetoric and these calls for quote unquote tougher approaches are dangerous, and they can resort to failed approaches that perpetuate harm, demonize rather than really supporting and rehabilitating young people, and they fail to promote long-term safety. At the same time, there's a lot of pressure on prosecutors right now that we really want to get into and educate all of the folks who are joining us about how they can best approach these issues. So, our panelists today bring incredible expertise to this discussion. I'm going to introduce them really briefly because their bios are too long to recite, but we will drop a link in the chat to their full bios. But really briefly, just to contextualize our speakers today, I'll give brief introductions. First, I am delighted to welcome District Attorney Jose Garza, who was elected by the people of Travis County, Texas, and took office in 2021. He has been reelected as well and started his second term in 2025. During his tenure as DA, he has prioritized reducing gun violence, centering the needs of survivors and victims, rebuilding the community's trust in the criminal justice system, and so much more. Under his leadership, the Travis County DA's office has sought to ensure that those who commit acts of violence in our community are held accountable, and he has championed data-driven strategies to address the root causes of crime. Welcome, DA Garza. We are thrilled to have you. Frankie Guzman is the Managing Director of Youth Justice and Equity at the National Center for Youth Law, where he leads a team of attorneys, policy advocates, and community organizers to transform youth justice systems. Frankie's work is focused on eliminating the practice of prosecuting and incarcerating children in the adult criminal system, reducing youth's involvement with the juvenile justice system, increasing developmentally appropriate services and opportunities for youth and young adults, and eliminating racial and ethnic disparities in the youth justice system. As a youth himself, Frankie was sentenced to serve 15 years in the California Youth Authority for armed robbery. Released on parole after serving 6 years, Frankie attended UC Berkeley and UCLA School of Law and became an expert in youth law and policy, focused on ending harsh punishments of youth and expanding health-based alternatives to achieve public health and safety. Welcome, Frankie. We're so thrilled to have you. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Sharif Ingram, who is the Speakers Bureau and Policy Coordinator at the Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project, where he fulfills their mission by helping those most affected by youth incarceration, using trauma-informed, values-aligned processes, and centering client partners in the work by giving them the opportunity to share their personal experiences with incarceration. Incarcerated himself at age 15, Sharif himself was charged and convicted in adult court and sentenced to a mandatory life sentence without any chance for parole. He served 23 years before being released after the U.S. Supreme Court decision of Montgomery v. Louisiana, which made retroactive an earlier decision, Miller versus Alabama, that it was unconstitutional to sentence children to a mandatory life sentence without parole, and we'll get into that. Sharif, we're thrilled to have you. Welcome. Oops, and I wanted to mention too that since his release from prison in 2020, Sharif has mentored youth in Philadelphia, especially children labeled high risk for violence, and he has worked full-time in construction and has served for 2 years on the advisory committee of the Pennsylvania Prison Society. So we're really thrilled to have you, and we'll talk more about some of those experiences. And finally, we have Joshua Rovner, who's a senior research analyst at the Sentencing Project, where he's been since 2014. And his work aims to limit the number of children and adolescents involved in the juvenile and adult justice systems by closing pathways to adult courts and supporting alternatives to incarceration. His work also encompasses youth serving extreme sentences, which is also a subject we'll get into today. Josh's work has supported reforms in numerous states through research and testimony, and he's the author of several papers and fact sheets for the Sentencing Project and has had opinion pieces published in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and many other esteemed publications. Welcome to our guests. I am so excited to dive into this really important and heavy conversation. Excuse me. So, I want to start by focusing, as we will be doing throughout this conversation, on prosecutors who face decisions often on whether to either try or in some cases just directly charge a young person as an adult or in juvenile court. So I want us to start our conversation by thinking broadly about how prosecutors should approach these decisions. So Dia Garza, let me turn to you as a prosecutor. I know that in Texas, and you can describe more about this, the law counts children, and I use that word deliberately, children 17 and up as adults by law. How do you approach decisions about whether to and how to charge kids, period? And how do you think about questions around adolescent brain development and the fact that, a 17-year-old is by most of our understanding a child to begin with? How do you approach some of those decisions?
First of all, Rachel, really great to be with you. Really appreciate this discussion and am grateful to be with so many fantastic panelists and looking forward to the discussion. For us, these decisions and every decision we make in the district attorney's office start with a simple question of what makes our community most safe. And when we ask that question, particularly as it relates to children who are accused of crimes, it's really hard to ignore the overwhelming body of data and evidence that I think at this point is quite clear that locking children up increases the likelihood that they will commit crimes in the future and actively makes our communities less safe. On the other hand, I think what the data also demonstrates quite clearly is that when we put in the work to understand the root causes of why children may have come into contact with our juvenile criminal legal system, and when we take the time to address the root causes of what brought them there, we are far more effective at preventing future harm, future crime, and future violence. So we absolutely take into account the development of children, of young people's brains. Not only do we take that approach for people who are formally classified as juveniles in our legal system, we also take that same approach for young people who are charged with what are considered adult crimes in the state of Texas. We have a number of programs that I'm looking forward to chatting with you about that specifically address young people who are accused of crimes in their late teens and early 20s. I am proud that, since 2021, we have not certified a young person as an adult. And I am confident that the approach that we've taken in all of these cases has been in the best interest of our public safety.
Thanks, Jose. And we'll get into a lot of what you just mentioned. I want to follow up in a few minutes about some of those programs. But first, I want to think bigger picture to start us. And Josh, I'm going to turn to you about, you've studied and are an expert in what happens when kids are sentenced as adults and are charged as adults as well. Can you tell us about what are some of the long-term impacts and short-term impacts you've seen when young people are charged as adults and put into the adult system? And particularly, if you can frame it about what you wish prosecutors understood that maybe they don't when they're making these decisions.
And thank you also, Rachel and IAP for putting together such a good panel on this. I mean, I think that the core thing that I think ought to be understood is the main impact in the aggregate is increases in crime. Sending kids to adult court makes us all less safe. We have decades of research on this, really because there's a lot of natural experiments. States have changed their laws at different paces to send kids to adult courts on different charges and through different pathways. And the results are pretty much always the same. So, you can look at a study, and the earliest one that I'm aware of was from New York State back in the late 70s, which changed its automatic waiver laws. And serious offending increased for its target population while it held steady in nearby Philadelphia. A couple of years later, they looked at Idaho, which passed some automatic transfer laws. And violent crime, that is to say, youth violent crime in Idaho, increased, while in neighboring Montana and Wyoming, the juvenile violent crime rates dropped. We have cases like this again and again and again, which is why when the CDC looked at all of these studies in the aggregate, they found that sending kids to adult court is more likely to increase reoffending and for the youth who reoffend on more serious charges. And so when you send a kid to adult court on gun possession charges, the next time they are more likely to have shot someone than someone who is retained in the juvenile court, which is going to be much more able to deal with the underlying behaviors and find an age appropriate consequence. The adult criminal justice system is really only interested in punishment. We use language around departments of corrections, but let's face it, nothing is really being corrected. Things are being punished. There's a value in the juvenile justice system around rehabilitation. And I think it's important to recognize that the system often fails in that regard, but it still has much better outcomes than the adult system does for youth. So I think that's the core thing that I wish that prosecutors understood. And I think it's also important to understand within that that the exceptions are also in the data. So we hear anecdotes of very serious cases that like, well, I sent that kid to the adult system or I sent this kid to the juvenile system and he reoffended. Those cases are in the data too. That the Cleveland Browns and New York Jets somehow or another won a game this year, but I'm willing to guess, I don't want to say willing to bet the way that the world exists now. I'm willing to guess they're not going to the Super Bowl, right? Like you don't look at an individual case to understand how things are in the aggregate. And so from a public safety perspective, sending kids to the adult system is going to make it much worse for all of us.
There's a lot there that I want us to unpack, particularly around addressing some of that misconception, this idea that there's a young person who has committed a very serious crime and that somehow this is a case that needs to go into the adult system. And so I want us to talk about why there's such a disconnect there. But before that, I want to ground this in some lived experience because I think that's really important. And Sharif, you have that experience. As I talked about in your bio, you spent a very long time in the adult system as a young person. And we are so glad that you are here and that you are doing such incredible work. I wanted to invite you to share whatever you're comfortable about your story, just to give us a sense of how some of the themes that both Jose and Josh were talking about around the lack of public safety repercussions of sending a young person to the adult system.
Yeah, so thank you. It was a lot. First, I just want to thank DA Garza, excuse me, DA Garza for not prosecuting, no longer prosecuting children in his state as adults, and taking that stand and taking having the backbone to take the criticism and the backlash and everything that come with that. I'm sure you saved a lot of kids from ending up like me or worse than me in the system. So I wanted to start with that. It's rare that I meet a DA that I think in other than when I'm on these types of panels. Uh so yeah, my a little bit about my story. I'm from Philadelphia, born and raised single parent mother. My father had passed when I was young. I got caught up in the streets, real young in the drug culture and just, coming up in poverty and things, trying to make fast money. And of course, with that culture as a kid, you don't really understand the things that come with it. The individual I was selling drugs for shot at me and some other individuals, what led later to his death. And when Josh was mentioned in regards to like the juvenile system, only thing I could think of, and I think it is often, is just how true that is, like how many resources I missed out on and going through the juvenile system where I really believe I could have benefited more from that system than the damage that occurred going through all of those years of the adult system. Uh, so anyway, I was charged with his murder at age 15. He was 24. And in my case in particular, there was a real push to prosecute me, not just as an adult, but to get me the maximum sentence of life when my case wasn't a first degree murder case. Individual was shooting at me under Pennsylvania law, even if you have a fear that's a reasonable fear, but it turns out later that it wasn't correct. Like you thought a person was reaching for a gun or something and you shot and it was reasonable. It was the last time you seen them, or 4 or 5 times they pulled and shot. Then this is not premeditated murder. Some cases it could be manslaughter, it could be third degree, but not first degree premeditated. I was charged with first degree, where the only sentence was the death penalty or mandatory life without any chance of parole. I was given mandatory life without parole. My case didn't fit the categories that meet the categories of a death penalty case sentence. So I served 23 years of this sentence before the Supreme Court made the ruling making it unconstitutional to sentence children to mandatory life without parole. And I've been home a little. Last September, it'd be was 5 years, so a little over 5 years. And yeah, that's been a mission of mine to try to help to change and push policy to make the system more accountable on how we treat our children, and also try to help the other kids to learn from my story and to help them avoid that system. Because I've seen a lot of children that went through the system like I did that didn't come out, that didn't survive it.
Sharif, thank you for sharing that. And I just wanted to ask something that you mentioned. You talked about missing out on services in the juvenile system that you think could have helped you because you were in the adult system while so young. Can you give us a little bit of an example of what are some of the services that you think would have benefited you and that you didn't have access to in the adult system?
Well, education was, very difficult. It took me about Uh, even though we was mandated to go to school in the state system, I took my pre-GED maybe like 10 times over the course of like 7 years, and was just like, I think the first time like 100 and something. You needed like a 240 to pass. And it was just like I would literally, like the education system was so bad in the adult system versus the juvenile system. 'Cause I was in the youth study center for a month and a half or so before they sent me to the county jail. And then I went upstate a year later. So, it's like the resources, every like now when I go to juvenile facilities, South Mountain, SYDC, the secure unit that's on the grounds of Greater Fort, and I see a lot of the programs that they have. I see some good programs. I see some things that's not so good, right? But I don't see anything that concerns me on the level of the adult system when I go in these facilities. I really see staff that's trying to help these kids. It's not an environment where you always walking around tense and you can't just be you and relax. I see just the programming, and I want to say normalcy, but not normalcy, but more normalcy than it is in the adult system. You see a lot of these kids still have their innocence and their kid-like behaviors with them. They're able to still be kids. When you're in the adult system, you a man. I don't care if you're 12 years old, you're 11 years old. You go in that adult system, walking around, smiling, joking, playing. All of that is done. Your childhood is over. So just that alone, like, I went into in a system where from the time I walked in there, it was like you gotta, you forced to be a man, you have to grow up. And along with that though, just the programs, the fact that the focus, like it was discussed, is more on rehabilitation, despite the flaws of the juvenile system. you know we find that kids, they benefit from these programs more. They get their house, a lot of them go through these programs, they get their high school diplomas like that. They have some of the best school programs in those juvenile facilities, because the main thing they push for them to get is at least their high school diploma, along with whatever treatment and programs and things they need, right? Whereas during the state system, you gotta fill that idle time. I did 23 years of dead time. Like, no programming, no jobs, no access to really anything other than the yard, the blocks, and for 23 years. As a lifer in Pennsylvania, I wasn't able to take no college courses and trades and all of that stuff, right? I had to educate myself. I had to literally like try to find teachers every jail I go to help me. Like, yo, why Kim struggling with this GED, man? And I went to like 4 or 5, 6 different state prisons before I finally found a teacher to help me. And I got my GED when I was like maybe 2005. So I was what, 23 when I finally got my GED, So it was just a lot that I think. And then my youth, I mean, of course, going into the juvenile facility and coming home, I would have still had my full life ahead of me, and coming home younger and really being able to build a life. Even though I'm grateful looking at some of my fellow juvenile lifers that came home even older than me, that I was able to come home somewhat still young and able to somewhat build a life for myself and try to rebuild my life rather.
Thank you, Sharif. And it's hard to imagine the loss that we would have all faced without having you still in there. So thank you for sharing all of that. I know it's painful to talk about.
Thank
And
you.
Frankie, I wanted to bring you in as well, to first of all see if you had anything you wanted to share or add to what Sharif said in terms of the real harms of being in the adult system versus the juvenile system. And then I also wanted you to help contextualize this, like who are the children that are getting prosecuted as adults in terms of racial disparities, other disparities. How is it sort of determined who gets prosecuted as an adult versus not, and from a sort of statistical perspective?
Sure. So on the first question, I am convinced that every decision to prosecute a young person in the adult system is really based on a desire to punish, although we might say incapacitate, but it isn't about rehabilitation. It isn't about making that person better, because we all understand that that's not the goal of the adult criminal justice system, and we shouldn't pretend that that is any motivation at all. Because if we're really true about wanting to, stop recidivism and crime offending and victimization, then we would do everything possible to pursue um, responses that are more likely to produce these, public safety outcomes. And so a decision to prosecute a kid as an adult is really a decision to employ state sanctioned violence against children in the name of victims' rights and, incapacitation. As to the disparities, I mean, I think we're all very well aware, and this is true in California and elsewhere, 80 to 90% of young people that are prosecuted as adults are Black and brown youth. And by brown, I mean so-called Hispanic or Latino youth and indigenous youth. But for, shorthand, I'll refer to them as brown youth, which I identify as. When we think about why that might be, it's also obvious that Black and brown youth are also people who are survivors, descendants of genocide, displacement, and slavery. And over history, we've always referred to these people and their children as being more dangerous and less deserving of opportunities, for positive youth development, but also for rehabilitation. And withholding those opportunities often looks like more punishment, more incapacitation, more adult prison, um, as we've been discussing. But also I think it goes deeper because it's also, I think a lot of our youth who are the most vulnerable are prosecuted as adults, kids with long histories in the child welfare system, youth who have experienced homelessness, sexual violence. Like I can't tell you how many times I've gone into prisons and met people who've committed the most serious crimes like murder or sexual crimes, who have had that done to them, who have been, victimized themselves, who then perpetuate this violence. And again, as speaking to a crowd of people who oftentimes speak to their role in defending victims' rights, I think that it's important that we understand why a person got to be where they are in order to address those behaviors and ensure that they don't happen again, rather than just be responsive in punishing them for things that are a manifestation of their own victimization and unaddressed trauma. Another thing I wanted to say is, we often have reforms, as folks that are always looking to be focused on solutions. More often than not, when we have reforms, that tends to benefit white youth. And so, as we see, a greater focus on adolescent development, rehabilitation, science, and data, we often see a shrinking in the numbers or a disappearance in the numbers of white youth. But what remains is often uh, a more distilled version of, or concentration of black and brown youth that remain in the system. And some of you might say, well, the data in our state isn't reflective of that. We have a significant number of white youth, as far as the data shows. But anybody who's working in the systems understands that oftentimes these are not white youth. In many states, brown youth are labeled as white youth. I know this, I work in Colorado also, where law enforcement and administrators of the system are empowered to identify according to their like subjective belief the appearance of the young person. And they often defend this practice as saying, well, it's racist, or it's somehow harmful to the young person to ask them their race, so we'll just assume. And it's always in to assume that they're white youth that we're incarcerating, which has the effect of inflating white numbers and minimizing brown numbers. And so oftentimes the amount or the proportion of brown youth that we see reflected in the data isn't accurate. There are greater numbers of brown youth that are being incarcerated, prosecuted harshly, and sent to the adult system. And when we do see white numbers, it's often um, inaccurate data, if not intentional, on the part of the system.
That's really interesting, Frankie. And I'm curious what you talked about how reforms can be only beneficial or primarily beneficial to white youth. What are some reforms that you advocate for that would be more widely helpful across the board?
Well, I'll say at always everybody talks about prevention, right? And early intervention, and diversion is something um, I think is coming around again, especially when you engage law enforcement. I talk to police often who say, I'm really reluctant to arrest these kids, send them to probation, nothing's gonna happen, it's a revolving door. If only there was someplace else that I could take these young people to, I would do that. And so having an array of options, to send young people, whether they're out late and need somewhere to sleep, something like a shelter, or, graffiti, whatever it is, smoking weed, the low level stuff, moderate to middle level stuff, they can and should have a place to be taken to in communities. And so that's one example, is when diversion programs are invested in. The first young people to be diverted away from the system tend to be white youth, affluent youth, youth who are perceived to be more deserving and less dangerous. But I think that diversion programs are equally beneficial to all young people. In California and in Colorado, my team and I have developed budget bills, laws that have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into diversion programs, funding community-based organizations to work in partnership with law enforcement, school police officers, and the like, to divert kids away from arrest. And these include at a rate of about 65% young people who were assessed as moderate to high risk for reoffending that were diverted into these programs. And tens of thousands of young people later, several years later, the recidivism rate for these young people who were diverted after 3 years is 30%. So it's meaning 70% success, 30% rearrest, which is the exact opposite of what the juvenile justice system is producing. Formal involvement in the youth justice system often produces recidivism at a rate of 70%. And so I think that when we, as decision makers, see a young person with a police report or an allegation of having committed something that's, serious, or that we perceive as serious, let's say, possession of a gun, why can't and why shouldn't that young person be diverted into a community setting where these people oftentimes who are, like myself and Sharif, who have lived this life, can better connect to these young people and help them understand, the what's wrong with that lifestyle, and the benefits of making healthier decisions from people who are credible to them, and authentic messengers, rather than incarcerating them, processing them, and somehow teaching them, or trying to teach them a better way of living, when all we've done is tear them down, and show them that this is the worst. I would say jail is criminogenic for sure, and we're teaching them the worst things when we incarcerate them, because all we've done now is taught them violence, intolerance, and connected them to a network of other people that they can collaborate with to do other illegal things.
Thanks, Frankie. And we're going to get into some real practical advice in just a minute for prosecutors, particularly in some of the really challenging cases that they face. But before we get into some of that, I want us to step back a little bit, because as we were all talking before this call, I think the point was made that this is one of the only areas of the law where you can sort of create a legal fiction, right? And say, this person is now an adult. So where did this come from? And where did this idea, and Josh, I'll turn to you to address this. Where did the idea that a kid can be prosecuted as an adult come from? How does it work in different states? And it's sort of, I guess what I'm asking is, where did this thinking that somehow it's more, what it's more effective from a public safety perspective come from, that we should treat young people in an adult system?
Interesting. So you'll often hear the story about how juvenile courts were created in 1899 in Chicago. And that's true. And what that means is that before that time, there was no such thing as trying a kid as if they were an adult. Every kid was tried as if they were an adult, 7-year-olds, 6-year-olds. Gosh, I just got back from Ireland, and there were 3-year-olds during the Irish potato famine who were sent to the Kilmainhole jail. I'm mispronouncing it because that's not my family history, because of their own poverty, like that they were begging on the street, and that was illegal during the Irish potato famine. And 3-year-olds who couldn't even fit like between the bars were sent there. There was an idea that came up in the late end of the 19th century, understanding that that adolescence was a unique stage of human development, and we ought to have a separate court system to recognize that. Along with that, though, there's a separate parallel track that juries just were refusing to convict 14-year-olds as if they were adults, knowing the horrors of adult prisons at the time. And, you saw a lot of prosecutors at the time who were the ones leading the charge to create a juvenile justice system so that these teenagers were not quite, quote, getting away with it. So, you ask this idea about like, where does this idea come from that sending kids to the adult system is a serious response? And I don't quite get it. I think about my own kids who, no matter what they do, no matter what grade they get in their AP US government class, they still can't vote until they turn 18, right? Like it just doesn't matter. No matter what my son does, the state of Maryland will not let him get a driver's license until he turns 16 and a half. And by the way, sign me up for that. I think that's a really good law because his judgment and his ability to drive, he's got a little ways to go there. And so the idea that there are certain things that a teenager can do that will allow us to say we're charging them as an adult, that's preposterous. We're charging them as if they're an adult, but these 15, 16, 17-year-olds, they're not adults. So we've had carve-outs from the beginning, and I can get into that history. But I think the idea that this is a serious response does not get to the fact that it's not a real response. It's just a knee-jerk response to thinking we have to punish this kid, as opposed to understanding anything that went on in their lives and actually try to do something to prevent them from reoffending and get to the underlying traumas that probably led to their involvement.
So, one thing that I'm thinking about as we're talking is there's by definition always some sort of bright line, right? So whether it's 18-year-olds are charged as adults, whether it's 17 years olds in Texas, sort of how should prosecutors really think about that? Because obviously, even when a child is not being prosecuted as an adult, many people would say an 18-year-old is a child too, and they're being sent to an adult system. So I'm just curious, sort of how you all think about that, and how, Diego, I can turn to you, like sort of how do you think about the the ramifications of sending any young person into an adult system, even if they're, you know, a day past 17 in Texas's case.
Well, we try to ground ourselves in the science and in the data, as Josh pointed out, and do our best every day to remind ourselves, to remind our team that the human brain is not fully developed until 27, 20, 26, something like that. And we know again, and we ground ourselves in the reality of the consequences of sending young people to prison. I want to go back, if I can, and I want to emphasize one of the points that Frankie made, because I think it's a really important one. About 2 years ago, here in Austin, we created a new deflection program that we call the Transformation Project, that allows law enforcement to deflect children accused of the crime that is the highest driver of criminal charges amongst children in our community out of our juvenile justice system and towards respite and a restorative justice program for the family and for the child that seeks to address the root cause of harm. First of all, for skeptics out in the audience, the reduction that we have seen in recidivism is nothing short of remarkable for children who have entered the program. And we do not screen out children based on their past contact with our criminal legal system or other factors. But what I really want to highlight is what's been most surprising to us about this program is the response from law enforcement. I think it is natural that they were skeptical when we started this program. But what's happened over the last 2.5 years is that we've seen a growing hunger for alternatives for law enforcement who encounter these challenges out in community every single day, and who are equipped really with just one tool to address it. And they see firsthand the fact that these are children struggling and oftentimes families struggling with unmet mental health needs, struggling with food insecurity, who are underemployed and don't have the training and education that they need to thrive. And so I just want to again to emphasize the point that Frankie made that often law enforcement is hungry for other options and to provide some assurances to our colleagues across the country that these are the kinds of outcomes that our law enforcement partners will appreciate. Back to your question, it is a part of why, to this point, we have not attempted to certify a child as an adult because we know that our juvenile system is far better equipped to address the underlying causes of why people are coming into contact with our juvenile system. And then I also want to just go back to a point I mentioned earlier, which is we've also built out multiple programs, some that are court-led, some that are driven by the district attorney's office, that really seek to meet young people. When I say young people, I mean, 18 to 30, where they are, and to really give them the tools they need to thrive, because it's not only is it the right thing to do, but it's in the long-term interest of our public safety.
Thank you so much. Sharif, I wanna bring you in because I think we've been talking about how Josh made the point of that it became this idea that we needed to do something serious. So we started prosecuting kids as adults. And he talked about how that's a false framing. So I'm curious for you, you've done a lot of talking with people in the community about this practice of prosecuting young people as adults. And I wanted to ask how you persuade people, but I also and I want to be very clear, this is not my perspective, but like, what do you say to people who might say, look, you are doing amazing work. Doesn't that prove that it's okay to send a young person to the adult system? Doesn't that, and Frankie as well, like, aren't these examples of the fact that someone can go to the adult system as a young person for a serious crime and then come out okay? How do you respond to that way of thinking, and how do you work to convince people, whether prosecutors or others, that this practice is ultimately not fair, but also not helpful for a public safety perspective?
Yeah, so I answer that one first. Actually, when you said that, I kind of forgot the first part, so I answer that one.
Sorry,
Uh,
I talked too much.
no, actually, because I just like the question. Like you know how your mind start working. Because this is something that you actually that I've heard people ask me that obviously, Rachel, I know you don't feel that way, but some people that ask the question, I really don't be knowing in what context they asking me. But I would say for one, when I was incarcerated, they had me labeled as high risk to reoffend, the highest risk, right? When I came home, they had me on the highest level of supervision and all of that. They didn't release me my first year. So obviously it's nothing that they did to help me to become rehabilitated in any way. In fact, the only programming that I really did, other than when I was on the juvenile block my earlier years in the system, was after Miller. No, not after Miller, after Montgomery came down. Because when the courts ruled in Miller that it was unconstitutional, that sentenced children to mandatory life without parole, Pennsylvania said, "Now we not following that ruling. Is not retroactive." It wasn't until 4 years later when the courts ruled in the Louisiana decision, Montgomery versus Louisiana, Supreme Court decision, that it was retroactive. Then they started pushing us into programming, and there was nothing that the DOC or the state or the system could ever do, or anyone could ever argue that the state did, to make me a better person. My years in prison was filled with chaos and violence, and years in isolation and special management units and lockdown units. So if that worked, y'all need to let everybody out that's in all of those special management unit that's high risk to offend, people that's in the maximum and super maximum security prisons that's not fit for other prisons. Then if for the people that have that argument, then okay, you're right, the system worked. So let all of them other lifers out that was labeled just as more dangerous than me, right? But in all actuality, the things that really, there's certain things in prison that uh the things that worked for me to make me better and to help me grow was everything in spite of the system, right? It was elders, uh, other older lifers that took me under their wing, to help to educate me, to take me to the law library. When I lost my appellate rights, to, fought with me for 2 years to get my appellate rights back, to help to teach me what manhood is, to even shave. I learned how to shave in the penitentiary. I didn't know how to shave. It took me years. I thought it was the most complicated thing ever to learn how to shave, right? So there was certain things that helped cultivated me and helped me grow, and it had nothing to do with the system, right? There's no staff member, there's no counselor, there's nobody throughout my 23 years of incarceration, 14 state prisons that I was housed at, some of them on more than one occasion. There's not one staff member I can say they helped me grow, right? That person helped me. This person, I mentioned the teacher earlier that helped me get my GED. So you had some of that kind of help, educate, you get a good teacher or something that, try to get you in some type of programming or something that'll go the extra mile for you, right? But as far as the growth and development that you find in there, for one, whatever the good people see of coming home and being so what successful, everyone has their scars that they come from behind them walls with, right? There's no way that a child can go in there and grow up behind them prison walls their whole life, their whole existence, right? Surviving things that you see other people not surviving, right? Not because they cowards, not because they can't fight, not because they just had odds against them where they just didn't survive it, right? Some people you look at you thought were stronger than you mentally. Some of the biggest, strongest dudes kill themselves because psychologically they can't take another day of it, right? So it's no way you can survive all of these things and come home and say, "Oh, see, the system worked." Because if you say the system worked, I can tell you how many ways it didn't work. You know, and how many people that it destroyed, how many kids that I grew up in there that's dead right now, not because of diseases or sickness or natural causes, no, because they was murdered in there. And I've seen more people be murdered in the state prison system by guards than other prisoners, right? So so that argument that is that obviously, oh, look, the system worked. Like I said, when I was incarcerated, I was labeled unfit for many general populations. So it's only, by the grace of God and a miracle that I even was able to get released. Even my legal team that was fighting to get me released, one of them is my coworker at YSRP now. That was my mitigation specialist, right? She'd tell you, it's like, we really did not think we was going to get Sharif time served. So even they didn't believe, not that they didn't believe in me and coming home and doing, but they just knew how it looked on paper, my file, and how the state and the DOC viewed me. So, anybody that make that argument, I would be the wrong person that try to make that argument concerning, because there's nobody in the state system that even try to make that type of argument and say, oh yeah, we're the ones that we got him straight and we did this and did that. There's no one in the state system that I think would ever even attempt to say that. But what was the first part of your question, if you remember?
Now I forgot too, Sharif, because I think I have follow-up questions as well. So we'll say that you covered it.
Oh, oh, about how do I get people
Yeah, how do you
something
frame the
about,
issue to folks?
yeah, so it's different people. I think you have to talk to in different ways. Like I went to Harrisburg yesterday, state capitol, and we had a press conference about some bills. Then we had a meeting before the Judiciary Committee and another joint committee. And I met with some senators that, in Pennsylvania, the Senate is controlled by Republicans, the House is controlled by Democrats. And this is the first time in doing policy work that we was able to get a bill through the House now, and now it's in the Senate. But the problem now, I got to work with the Republicans. So when trying to get across to them, is very difficult. It's very different than talking like to the liberal base, because some of the liberal base still be on the fence about, everybody is not how DA Garza is just because they're liberal. A lot of people that are liberals still believe in prosecuting children and putting them in adult prisons. The Black Caucus was the ones that pushed for a lot of this stuff in the 90s, the Democrats, in the 90s, right? So the conversation with them is a little different. I'm still trying to really figure that out. I know that when you speak to them with lived experience and the facts of lived experience, in my face, I find that they don't try to contradict it. It kind of like shocked even some of the hardest Republicans that I speak to when they hear my story. And whether it will cause them to actually do anything, I don't know. But at least just getting them down to have a conversation is very difficult. Now, on the flip side of that, I think in general, I try to talk to people, whether it's policymakers or what have you, that's liberals or not, hardcore conservatives. I try to talk to them with common sense reason and just, sharing my story and the things that I went through, the things that I witnessed. And a lot of the injustices of the system that people don't realize and the way that they are destroying our communities. I think the main thing that people don't think about is that when we send a child to adult prison, the majority of them are not going in there for life, right? We speaking about the juvenile lifer issue. That was a unique issue that it was a lot of us that got affected by it. But speaking of the grand scheme of things, the overwhelming majority of kids that go in the adult system, whether it's for a month or 6 months in the county jail or 5 or 6 years in the state prison, is coming back to our communities, right? How is this bringing about public safety? We have children that are going into the system damaged, right? Already going through all levels of trauma and confusion and distrust. And we put them in a system where they have to fight for their literal survival in ways that even in society they didn't have to, right? What do you think that does to a kid's mind frame that now you release back to society? You did nothing to treat them or address the underlying issues that caused him to create a harm to society to begin with. The person that is the most likely to change and be rehabilitated is a child that's still developing. His brain is still developing. His reasoning and all of that is not fully developed yet. This is the person you should be trying to reach while him or her is still a child, while they are still developing. But when we put that child in that system and then they come back home and create a greater harm, right? Whose fault is that, man? And who's the victim? Because I would argue that the child is the victim as well. He was victimized when he went into the system, an adult system that he wasn't equipped to survive. Then he was criticized because he came back to society and reoffended and went back when there was nothing done to help that child to correct the first wrong.
Sherry, thank you for all of that. And, I think I'm just going to play devil's advocate a little bit. I think there are probably prosecutors watching, and I want to mention there's a lot of great questions in the chat that we'll get to in a minute. But there's a lot of prosecutors who may be watching and saying, look, I don't want to victimize anyone, to your point, Sharif. I'm not trying to, I don't want to prosecute kids as adults, but I have a case that's, a very, very serious case where maybe if I keep the kid in the juvenile system, then they won't spend, quote unquote, a long time in custody. And if they go to the adult system, there'll be harsher consequences. Um, and they say, it's a hard decision and I don't know what to do. How do I balance these really hard decisions where there's a real concern about the level of seriousness of the case? And Frankie, let me ask you, um, what advice would you say to prosecutors in those situations who are saying, look, there's public pressure and political pressure to prosecute this young person as an adult, but there's also maybe some short-term real public safety concerns about incapacitating that young person who is on a, let's say, dangerous path. How should prosecutors think about and approach those cases? What advice would you give them?
Sure, and I'll just acknowledge that politics is the problem. It's like I don't think that politics should be playing a role in these decisions, but the reality is what it is. But if really we're most concerned about outcomes, ensuring that this young person doesn't do this again, right? Like I know for a fact, if we have a young person who suffers from, I'll just say this is true of most young people we're dealing with, low self-esteem, childhood trauma, which comes from abuse, abandonment, neglect, and immaturity. Those are the three things that are affecting all of them. What is prison going to do for that, for those three issues? Because we often talk about risk assessments, right? And some places do risk and needs assessments, but then what do we do with that? Like, I don't think the system, as a whole knows what to do with those. Like, we're often focused on the static factors, things that will not change, like the crime itself, things that have already happened. And then we're focusing our responses on those things. And it has the effect of just responding poorly to a very severe matter. When if we're really interested in ensuring, future public safety, then let's focus on those dynamic factors, things that can change, attitudes, behaviors, who the kids hang around with, things like that, their values. And back to where I was starting with this is sending them to prison is only going to make those things worse. You're sending them to criminogenic environments with adult populations who are, oftentimes I just say like way deeper or far gone. I don't know, like I can't speak for all the folks in prison, but there are people that young people should not be around in environments that are not conducive to healthy development. And programs that are not designed for them and aren't effective even for the adults that they are designed for. So it's really a matter of what can we do with the time that we have in the juvenile system to turn these kids' lives around. I think that that also then implicates like, well, what are we doing to support probation and corrections, whatever form it takes in a particular jurisdiction, to be better? And I know that DAs often say, well, our role is, to litigate in the courtroom, which is true, but I also know that they do a lot of advocating in other spaces, and I feel like the response to working with corrections and probation and advocating for more accountability, more, let's focus on the outcomes there because I'll tell you, they get a free pass. And every time corrections, Department of Corrections and probation does a terrible job, we blame the young person who was basically subjected to treatment that isn't healthy treatment. And when they come out and do this again, we blame them, but it's the system that's failed. And I understand why oftentimes prosecutors don't want to rely on that system. And then here is the kind of the issue within the question that isn't being asked is how can we be confident that a young person who goes to the juvenile system will come out better when we're seeing so much failure, right? And it isn't because young people are themselves failing, it's the system that's failing them, right? And so oftentimes we're left with this, this what we feel like is a catch-22, like we're damned either way. But I really feel like there are many jurisdictions in this country that do well, that tried to work. It's like the whole we got lemons, so we make lemonade. Prison designers, juvenile hall designers are designing juvenile halls and youth prisons modeled after the adult system. And so, like, that's sometimes a bust. What can you do with that? Paint it light blue, something that's, more mood altering, like the yellow behind me on this wall. I think that the place where we can focus on is the developmental approaches and programs, opportunities, and services that are occurring or not occurring within those systems. Um, I can't tell you how many times, I've heard like, I cannot talk to that person. The jailer should not be the therapist. So when we're sending kids into the juvenile system, we should be doing more to ensure that there are mental health practitioners, credible messengers, people that these kids can confide in when they're going through stuff. Sometimes it's an issue of culture that a corrections officer will not appreciate or understand, but it's very real to that young person who's an adolescent mammal and cares more about what their friends think than what a corrections administrator thinks. And so to get back to my point is like I think that when we're talking about what should we do, we should trust the youth system because the youth system is better equipped to deal with young people with severe needs. Oftentimes, where the youth system fails is by its design, is emulating the adult system, and we need to move away from that. And I think prosecutors have a role in advocating for more appropriate places that are not going to create more sophisticated criminals. Let's just say that. Second, the programs that are happening in there. We need to abandon this idea that the developmental approaches are somehow psychobabble or touchy-feely. Like when I got out of youth prison, I spoke to everybody, my mom, my girlfriends, like prison guards spoke to me because that's how I was raised, and it caused me a lot of problems that I've worked for many years to like undo. And the socio-emotional learning needs to happen at some point. Let's have it happen as much as possible while we have them. And then lastly, I'll say the aftercare. Aftercare isn't simply surveilling these young people and making sure, we're going to catch them when they commit another crime. Anything a young person on probation or parole does is a crime. How about we support them with stable housing? Some of these people's parents got issues, and what can we do about that? But as much as we can, work with them or other responsible adults who are going to take care of them. And also these opportunities for self-actualization. Because I started by saying most of these young people that we're dealing with are suffering from immaturity, low self-esteem, and trauma. So we should do everything we can to deal with that. And for me, I found a lot of support and rehabilitation at community college. When I was 21 years old, I joined student government, and that allowed me to put a lot of like my energy and skills that I exercise as a gang member and as a prisoner in that space, and I became an advocate. And it taught me to cuss less. Being the public relations officer, I did a lot of activities. I networked with the administrators in a system that were looking at me more strength based than deficit based, and so it empowered me to do more. And all of that was a positive upward cycle where I healed, I matured, and I began to see myself as a positive person, not as a failure, a fuck up, or a loser. And so I think that as prosecutors, I mean, this was a long answer to a question, which is do not just feel like you're relying on two bad options, the adult system, which doesn't produce anything good, and the juvenile system, which is severely flawed. I think that we should do what we can to improve the one option that has potential, which is the youth system, and make it what it's supposed to be, which is developmentally appropriate to turn kids' lives around by addressing immaturity, low self-esteem, and trauma.
You covered so much there, Frankie, including some of my questions I was about to ask. So thank you. I'm going to turn to the DA in a second, but before that, I wanted to ask you, Josh, what do you say to prosecutors, um, or what do you think prosecutors don't understand about this issue? And particularly to Frankie's last point around, a lot of prosecutors saying, look, the juvenile system isn't great either, right? There's a lot of problems with it. So, when I'm balancing, maybe the balance to me falls in favor of adult. How do you respond to that? And sort of, what do you wish that prosecutors had a better understanding or insight around these decisions?
I think prosecutors really do have a good handle on so many of the flaws of when young people are charged as if they're adults and what the actual results are. We have a really good study from the Bureau of Justice statistics about young people who are charged as if they were adults and the thin proportion who are actually convicted as if they're adults. And partly that's because of actual innocence or an inability to prove a case, but there's also reverse waivers that exist in so many jurisdictions. And when that happens, like I'm really familiar with Maryland, where I live, and we see that youth who are initially charged as adults, they wait about 5 months on average before their reverse waiver hearing happens. And that's like dead time. Nothing happens for those kids. And for the most part, by the way, that's gun possession charges. That's the most common reason young people in Maryland are charged as if they're adults. So for 5 months, they get no treatment whatsoever. And so we know that the best way to limit offending is swiftness of punishment. It's not the severity of the punishment. So the connection between the offense, and this is even assuming guilt, and the consequence is much longer in the adult system. And so it's going to fail on that account. Prosecutors know this. So I think what prosecutors miss out on is their amazing influence with the media to educate them on or off the record about what actually happens when a young person is charged as an adult. Like it's a really good headline on day one. They get to hold their press conference. They get to say, like, I'm taking this seriously. And and there's less follow-up because there's the next shiny object the next day, the next month, when the case ends up pleading down to be a reverse waiver into the juvenile system. So I think that what prosecutors fail to understand is the deep, deep ignorance of our media, especially television media, of what happens when young people are charged as adults and what the actual outcomes are. So I talked and I will talk ad infinitum about the public safety impacts. I think it's important to realize that young people who are charged initially as an adult are not necessarily convicted as if they're adults. I don't know that the media gets that, right? Like, and so talk to them on the record, off the record, bring them to the adult jails to show where the kid is being held, to show how awful these situations are. The data are so clear on the abuse. And by the way, the jailers aren't that good at hiding how hideous these facilities are, even when the cameras show up. So I would say shine a light onto what adult charges actually mean and to understand what the real outcomes are.
Thanks, Josh. And Jose, I want to turn to you to talk about, you know, what you say to your fellow prosecutors around this issue, and particularly when they say, look, I wish I had more resources. I wish I had more options other than these two bad systems. How do you respond to that? What advice do you have for your fellow prosecutors?
Well, let me just say that I obviously really empathize with the position that so many of my colleagues are in across the country. Um, I do my best to meet with every family of a homicide victim in our community, juvenile, adult. And so I've had many of these conversations with parents over the last 5 years who are hurting, who are just experiencing an enormous amount of trauma and pain, and who are looking to you, our colleagues across the country, to fill that void, to address that pain um, by um, by punishing a child, by punishing someone who committed harm against them. And I know how difficult those conversations are. I think, first of all, we have a responsibility to treat all crime survivors and their families with dignity and respect. But I think we also have a responsibility to understand that treating people with dignity and respect is different from um, allowing them to believe that by sending a kid away, whether it's to an adult prison or to a lengthy term of prison, is going to address the trauma and pain that they're struggling with. And at the end of the day, the overwhelming majority of us are charged with seeing that justice is done. And I just think in the face of the reams of data that exist on outcomes in the juvenile and adult system, it is increasingly difficult to pretend that attempting to certify or prosecute a child as an adult is just in any way. I also, I think that Frankie is right. We have a responsibility as prosecutors to advocate for more options. When those options don't exist, we have a responsibility to go out and build them. As prosecutors, we have an enormous amount of power in our criminal legal system, and we really have a responsibility to build out those options. Now, that is not a responsibility that should fall to our line prosecutors who are overworked and underpaid in the overwhelming majority of instances, but it is a responsibility that should fall to the leaders of offices across the country. We should also be advocating for more community-based solutions and resources that address, as I've said repeatedly, the root causes that lead kids into contact with the juvenile justice system, whether that's more services for more mental health services, job training, education services, services to help kids deal with substance use. But I think when I think about being in the room with the victim and the practical advice to colleagues, I think obviously we have a responsibility to empathize, to be empathetic. But as I said, I think we also have a responsibility to recognize that accountability and punishment are not the same thing, that justice and punishment are not the same thing. And that ultimately is our responsibility to stand firm in the face of that pain, to make sure we're getting just outcomes. And we can do that and meet the needs of victims of crime.
Thank you so much. One final question for you, Sharif, before I give you all sort of 1 minute to just quickly respond to a quick question before we take the many really great questions in the chat. Sharif, we've talked a lot about what didn't work, all the harms of the adult system. You work with young people as a mentor now. And so what have you seen be effective, putting aside juvenile adult system, what has actually worked to teach accountability, to promote accountability in young people, and to sort of help them to get on a different path? What have you seen be effective?
I see it be very effective. Just having older mentors, other men in their lives. A lot of formerly incarcerated people, not just myself, that's out here working with these kids. I think that's like the greatest thing that a lot of us could do in giving back. And I think that helped a lot. Them releasing us, I think one of the hidden things that many people don't really discuss is how effective a lot of us are in being able to reach these kids out here because of our lived experience. So it's not just the policymakers that that they come to respect lived experience. Lived experience always been respected in the streets, right? So it's like taking that and using where these kids look at it as something to be looked up to, that you was this or you was that, and flipping that and educating them. If they're going to listen to anybody, more than likely they're going to listen to us more, right? So we have a program at YSRP called IGHC, Intergenerational Healing Circle. We've been discussing ways to try to expand it. It's a group, it's just that, an intergenerational healing circle. I don't run it. Another former juvenile lifer oversee it. I'm just a member of it. And what it is, it's an intergenerational healing circle where it's intergenerational. We have younger client partners that YSRP were able to get decertified over the years that YSRP has been in existence. So they was all charged as adults, but either they was decertified and did like juvenile life or some time in secure facilities, or they was charged as adults, did a little bit of time there in the county and came home. Then we have juvenile lifers, some that did 30, 35, 40 years. That's part of the IGHC, some of whom was mentors to me in prison that I spoke of earlier that are home now that are part of the IGHC. So this, we come together, man, and it's all men too. It's it was a women's IGHC, but I don't know what happened to it. It kind of felt, it wasn't a lot of women. It was, I think, only like 4 of them or something. But we all talk and we learn from the young folk on the things they need and things that, how a lot of the times the older people, even those of us that come from the streets that's older, we look at the younger generation and we criticize them and say, man, these kids retarded, man. They this and they that. But we forget, man, that's what they used to say about us when we was kids. It was strange the stuff we were doing to the older generation, right? But when, us coming from the conditions and knowing how much we were harmed, I think we have to look even more to these children and find unique ways to reach them. And a lot of time it's just that, having somebody like me, somebody like Frankie that's there for them, somebody they can talk to, somebody they can, that they know don't have no ulterior motive. Some of these kids don't have nobody that they feel sincerely care about them, right? So this group, we go on retreats. We just went out Bald Eagle Resort, way out Western PA, near State College. We got a donation, or the organization got us some minivans, and we went out there for the weekend. Nice resort, went fishing, walking the trails, just hanging out around the campfire, talking, and healing. And we have these therapy sessions. Basically, we come together and we discuss different topics over Zoom, sometime in person, every other week, every other Saturday for 2 hours, right? So I think it's things like that that's needed. Unique. These are the things that I see that's effective. Of course, there's a lot of other things that's effective. There's a lot of nonprofits doing a lot of grassroots work, doing a lot of work out here in our communities, in Philadelphia in particular, that's out here reaching these youth, trying to be violence interrupters, and all of those things. So these are the things that I see that are most effective in bringing about community safety, as well as trying to deal with cultivating our youth.
Appreciate that, Sharif. And before we turn to questions, I just want to give each of you a chance to very briefly, if you can, share one final point you want to make sure that those watching can take away from today. Ideally, something that hasn't been covered yet, if you have something that's top of mind. Why don't I start with you, DA?
Well, I think the only point I want to make is just to emphasize that it is possible, that it is possible to treat kids like kids, to improve the safety of our community, um, and to survive as prosecutors. We can do both of those things.
Thank you. Frankie.
Oh man. Well, I'll just say, I think that we should all understand that, life course criminology and a lot of the research shows that most young people, even young people who commit the most serious crimes, will age out of criminality, even if we do nothing. And so our responses should be, sure as we can to not make things worse and not to overpunish. What does it benefit us to send a kid to adult prison for life when by age 30 they will become a very different person and could be contributing to society on the outside. And so I just think that our responses should really focus on making our communities healthy, because the only safe communities are healthy communities. And I think there's a lot that prosecutors can be doing to make the system be functional at producing um, positive results, and in particular for young people to grow up healthy, because otherwise we're just, making things worse and relying on violence to
Yeah,
be
hold
ineffective.
that thought because there's a question that's on point that we'll get to in a second.
Sure.
Sharif, let me turn to you next. Any final comments?
Yeah, I would just, echo, man, which basically this whole thing is about, that, children are children. This should be something that we should all get. I mean, the fact that we place children in adult prisons, it's so harmful. I think that, in closing out, going back to what you said, I really sometimes I hate when people commend me for how well I'm doing out here, because without them saying that, it's like they saying like, oh yeah, see, he made the system. And then another person that's not doing as well, they be like, oh, well, look at him. He ain't working. He ain't doing this. He ain't got that. And he may not have had the same support system I had. He may not have had the same motivation. He may have come home more traumatized and more institutionalized than I was, right? And that's not to say that I don't have all of those same issues. You just don't see them. You just don't see them. A lot of us have invisible scars that are just as ugly and just as big as the physical scars that you see people coming home with a missing eye and missing tooth and limbs. And, people we see coming home with slashes on their face that, they have these physical scars for life. A lot of us have scars that are worse than that are not physical. You don't see. So don't never think that anyone that you see that went through the system as a child, that's doing somewhat okay in life and thriving, to use them as an example for someone that got out that's not thriving, right? And just understand and look at that as an example. When you place a child in the system, you don't know how he's going to come out of that adult system, if he's going to come out at all.
Great point. Josh, last comment before we turn to Q&A.
Yeah, there's such a constant tinkering in this realm of whether automatic charges or prosecutorial discretion, judicial waivers. The idea that we can concoct a perfect recipe of 14-year-olds or 16-year-olds on carjacking or armed carjacking or gun possession, like that's the basic flaw. Like we really need to be looking at young people the same way we want ourselves to be looked at, not as the worst thing we've ever done, but as a fully formed human being who needs to be addressed in totality. Starting all cases in juvenile court is a pretty reasonable moderate solution that says, let's look at the circumstances. Let's look at everything this young person has done, the programming they've been through. Look, as an organization, as an individual, I'm never going to advocate on behalf of a young person going to adult courts that the results are much worse for them. But for prosecutors who are so sure that this child is irredeemable, go prove it before a judge. I don't think that's a lot to ask. And I think that the idea that we can tinker with our state laws for just the right ages or just the right charges, that's the idea we need to get away from. Like it's individuals who need to be addressed.
Thank you. And thank you for all the questions in the chat. If I rush you all, it's because I want to get to as many of them as we can. The first question we've got is why isn't there creation of facilities with mental health services for juveniles that are charged as adults? And I think what this question is getting at is there a way to have special programs within adult prison for young people? And what is your response to that? Josh, I see you unmuting, and Frankie, so I'll let
Yeah.
you go.
So we do have those places. They're juvenile detention centers and they're youth prisons, right? Like we have a 1 day count. And I think about 8% of the kids in the 1 day count are kids who are charged as if they're adults. Like the juvenile facilities are more than capable of providing those services. Why do you have to send them to that other building instead of this building when this building is the one that already has the staff on hand? Like, why would you recreate the wheel somewhere else when we have youth serving facilities? That would be my answer to that question.
Frankie, did you have something to add?
Yeah, and I'll just say, there are facilities and units like that in the adult system around the country, and here's my bias. I just don't think prisons are good at producing positive mental health results. And so if we basically have an adult system and a unit within it, it's still overseen by a warden who has no experience or expertise in anything other than keeping people from escaping prison. And so I'll just tell you, throughout California, we have 33 prisons. We are constantly dealing with lawsuits for inadequate mental health care, physical health care, safety, security, all these things because the warden has the final say. And so if the warden can't attract talent, can't retain talent, our prisons are in places where no doctors, reputable doctors want to work, we're going to have a severe, shortage of these services. And so oftentimes when there is that unit, judges will say, well, I'm going to send them to the adult system because I know that the adult system has these particular programs for young people or for people with mental health issues. And then you go and you see them and it's pure garbage. It's just in name only. And so it's just like we can't really trust these, which kind of goes back to what I was saying before, which is like there is no accountability on the system to do the thing that they're purporting to be doing. But all that to say, they do exist. They're ineffectual, and oftentimes it's because they're driven by corrections administrators who have no idea what healthcare is about, education, rehabilitation, any of these things are not in their wheelhouse. It's not why they're in the role that they're in.
Thank you so much. Our next question, do any of the panelists have any thoughts on the statistics that show that the rate of juvenile violent offending and juvenile victimology has raised significantly in New York City since the Raise the Age law went into effect in 2018, especially given that most other states show a reduction? Josh, I'm not sure if that's a question for you.
I mean, this is what peer-reviewed research does as compared to the anecdotal data. So you don't really just want to look at New York City and what happened in 2020 versus 2023, but sort of look at Northern New York versus Vermont, look at Buffalo versus Cleveland and Pittsburgh, New York City versus Northern New Jersey. These are the apples to apples comparisons that peer-reviewed research happens. Now, what's really frustrating for those of us who have this foot in the research is, my God, it takes forever. right? Like the peer-reviewed research takes forever, whereas the anecdote can happen really quickly. Now, regardless of what the data shows any one year, in the aggregate, we know that it's a failed policy, right? So I think that we need to be looking at what is best for the individual young person who may or may not be convicted of the crime that they've been arrested on. And I think that we know that the juvenile system is capable at dealing with these young people. The problem in New York State in particular is they passed a raise the age law that also said that there were going to be programs that were going to be funded. Now, New York State has biffed all of that. They've decided not to fund those programs for the youthful offenders. So it is not the implementation that was promised at the time. So fund the programs regardless of what the data show. Send kids to the juvenile system regardless of what the data show, because that is what's best for the young people and best for public safety.
Thanks, Josh. The next question is for DA Garza, although I would note that I think the IIP is engaged in this answer. The question is for that organizations like the district attorneys associations that lead policy and advocacy in many states like New York seem to be in full-throated support of back to quote unquote law and order thinking. Are there systemic national efforts to get your views and data, et cetera, in front of them? And that's why I said the IIP is one of those.
Rachel, you just stole my answer.
Sorry.
No, I'm kidding. Yes, I mean, but I did want to lead with the IIP is one of them, and that's why this conversation is so important. But yes, there are several. IIP is a great one. Fair and Just Prosecution is another. There are several organizations around the country who are, I think, bringing prosecutors together to share some of the innovations that are happening, that are succeeding around the country to make our communities more safe. I will say I was very skeptical of my state association before I took office. My state association is not perfect by any means, but I think one of the things I've learned about at least our state association here in Texas is that what our association values most is our discretion, is the idea that of the role that democracy plays in our criminal legal system, and the idea that communities should have the right to play an enormous role in what the justice system looks like. And so our association typically is not looking for mandatory anythings. We want the ability to be able to assess every case, every context, and make the decision that is in the best interest of justice, and to be able to be responsive to our communities. So, again, I do want to acknowledge that is a role that many associations play across the state. Yes, there are I think some fantastic national organizations that are trying to change the way that we as prosecutors think and talk about these issues, and I think to great success. By the way, I will just note that I think over the last 5 to 6 years, despite some of the negative publicity, what we see over and over and over again is that reform-minded prosecutors, reform-minded district attorneys, state's attorneys, however they are referred in your jurisdiction, are still being elected at, I think, at high rates in the South, on the East Coast, on the West Coast, in the Midwest. And I think it's because, one of the other things that the data shows is that our communities are hungry for change. They know that this system does not work, that it doesn't meet their needs, that it doesn't improve the safety of our community. And I think most communities across the country are hungry for leaders who are going to shift the way we think about this, to challenge the status quo, and to be courageous enough to try new things and to follow the data.
Thank you. The next question I will ask to the group, but I would just ask that whoever jumps in, please keep your answer very short. We're going to try to get through 5 questions in 5 minutes. Why prosecute kids at all? This is the question, Frankie, I was saying to put a pin in. How might we help youth who harm others make better choices without bringing them into the carceral system? In other words, challenging the premise that we should keep kids in the juvenile system and saying, should we prosecute them at all? Frankie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it's our culture of violence. I mean, it started with this. We are a country that was founded on violence, murder, rape, theft, slavery, genocide, all these things. And I think that also there are many other countries who don't focus as much on punishment and have much better results. So what is it about us that makes us feel like violence teaches kids the right thing? More guns makes us safe, more punishment makes us safe. It just doesn't. And I think that oftentimes the bullies in the room all win out, and the more enlightened people, the health-based, minded people are often silenced because, that's just, I think, that the culture and the politics we have in this country. But that's not to say that we can't change. So why punish kids at all? I just think that is, the culture we have. It's in our DNA, and until we accept that that's a flawed way of being and thinking, and take other countries and other jurisdictions as their examples as a path forward, we're always going to be like this. We need to change. So much of who we are as a nation needs to change, but certainly, how we respond to unhealth, and the manifestations of poor health exhibited by young people, I think are opportunities for us to demonstrate that science is real. Compassion, hope, humanity will prevail if we employ it. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to be the very unsafe, brutal nation that we've been.
Thank you, Frankie. And I wish we could have time to get everyone's input on that one, but I want to move on to some practical questions. One is coming, I assume, from a prosecutor saying, what do we do as prosecutors when the players in the juvenile justice system will testify at a transfer hearing that they lack the resources to help youth charged with adult offenses? How do we balance that issue with the public safety issues? We have a lot of youth committing more and more violent offenses in our community, and this is the struggle we are facing. You want to take that one?
I think I'll just acknowledge that the obvious, that struggle is real. That although it's important to recognize that the power we have as prosecutors, that it is also important to recognize the limitations we have as prosecutors. That we are but one part of a system that is built on all the things that Frankie just identified. And it is a challenge. I don't know that I've got the silver bullet answer. Of course, we struggle with the same thing, but we do in most jurisdictions across the country have charging discretion. And so if you're concerned about what might happen at a transfer hearing down the line, there is some discretion we have on the front end about what charges we settle on, what outcome we agree to. That may make maybe harder choices for us on the front end. Maybe it means we're choosing supervision over incarceration to avoid that instance. But again, I don't think there is a silver bullet answer. The last thing I do want to just mention quickly, we've touched on it, but I think it bears emphasizing. Many of our communities are seeing upticks in crime and violent crime alleged to have been committed by children. And I think it is really important for us to advocate for additional resources and tools to address those increases. No one is suggesting that we should turn and look the other way, but we have a responsibility to find solutions that actually work, because so many times, and again, the data supports this over decades, these solutions don't. And so whether that's advocating for more community-based resources, going to our commissioners' courts and our city government to ask for more resources and different tools, our law enforcement partners want them too. And we've got to be looking at those violence prevention strategies, whether it's community-based violence intervention, whether it's transformative justice. There's a whole range of other options that we've got to push for and explore.
Thank you so much. I'm going to combine the next two questions from the same person who who's writing about how in New York there's a youthful offender court for certain offenses for juvenile and adolescent offenders. The alternative to retaining these youthful offenders is sending them to family court, which is very private and can be a bit of a black box. Prosecutors and judges find their hands tied by not being able to access the records of what ultimately happened in family court. So, one of their questions is, should youthful offender records be under seal, or should these records be accessible to prosecutors and judges in future prosecutions? Why or why not? Anyone want to take that one? Josh?
I can't speak for New York specifically, but I'll just always say, as a defense-minded person, anything that the prosecution, any information that they have can and will be used against the kid. And I just have a hard time believing that prosecutors on the whole will use that information for benevolent purposes. And that's just the bias, right? I'm sure that's not everybody, but I think the concern is if there are a few bad actors who will use this to as aggravation, or aggravating factors, then it's best to not have it included at all.
Josh, did you want to weigh in on that one?
I think I agree with what Frankie said there.
Okay. Last question, which is a challenging one. How do you have this conversation with a family when the victim who is deceased is also a youth? How or why should they understand that this juvenile should not be tried as adult for murder when their child was murdered and not engaging in the type of actions as the defendant, assuming that is the case? So just getting at the heart of having tough conversations with victims. Jose, I don't know if you wanted to answer this, as you've talked a lot about your efforts to really center victims.
Yeah, I mean, again, let me start by saying I have these conversations every week. I've had that exact conversation more times than I would care to count over the last 5 years. And it is not easy, and I will not pretend that it is. But I think there's just a couple of things that we have to root ourselves in, and then I'll share at least my practical perspective on how I try to have those conversations. Um, I mean, first, just to answer your question directly, I think most families don't understand. But let's be honest, none of this makes sense. Our juvenile justice system does not make sense. It also doesn't make sense, to think that that sending a child to prison, particularly an adult prison, is going to heal those victims. And so we should also not pretend that it will. We are also doing a disservice by allowing them to believe that sending a child to prison is going to fill that void or heal that pain. It will not. And we are complicit in their pain if we allow them to believe it will. What we try to do is have honest conversations, and we do our best to set expectations at the outset. In our first meeting, we do our best to let people know what the typical kinds of outcomes are in our jurisdiction for these kinds of, for whatever the conduct is that brings them as victims into our office. We do not, again, we think it is a disservice. It's an abdication of our responsibility to put on a victim what the outcome should be. We do not say, what do you want? What is the outcome that you're looking for? Because one, we can't guarantee it, but for most of us under our laws, those are responsibilities that fall to us. It's why we are elected, why we're hired into these jobs. And it's the responsibility that the law places on us and that we have to own. So again, I know that's not easy. That may not even be helpful. But again, I just want to acknowledge that these are incredibly difficult conversations. I want you to know that I have these conversations personally on a weekly basis. And I think the best I can say is that what I have found to be most helpful is to be empathetic and honest at the outset.
Thank you so much, Jose. And I know there's so much else to cover. These are such tough conversations and such important ones. And I really want to thank everyone for coming, for engaging so much with all your questions. We at the IAP very deeply care about this issue, and we'll be continuing to focus on juvenile justice issues. Please feel free to reach out to us. We're at prosecution.org if you have questions. you want to check out some of our resources. But for now, I just want to thank all of our panelists so much for coming and for being part of this really wonderful and enriching conversation where I wish we could have covered even more. But thank you all for sharing your expertise, your stories, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. See you soon.